From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Horder.
Day 4 of the war between Israel and Hamas, with Israeli forces pounding targets in Gaza from the air, but no official word on a ground invasion. President Biden today speaking from the White House, forcefully declaring support for Israel.
In this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel.
Republican lawmakers in the House are meeting this hour to try to eliminate some of the chaos coming from Congress and choose a leader. Both leading candidates expected to address the caucus.
This hour, we'll speak with John Kirby from the White House, former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, and Eliav Benjamin, Israel's deputy head of mission to the United States. We've got a lot to learn over the next hour here, Anne-Marie, on a day that President Biden finally addressed the nation on this war in Israel.
Yeah, he struck quite the tone, Joe, really coming out saying the U.S. supports Israel unequivocally, unwavering. He called it sheer acts of evil, that massacre we saw it over the weekend. But sadly, he had an update on the Americans and the death toll of the Americans in Israel. Yeah. Take a listen to what the president said earlier today.
This was an act of sheer evil. More than 1,000 civilians slaughtered, not just killed, slaughtered in Israel. Among them, at least 14 American citizens killed.
We go straight to the White House now to spend time with Admiral John Kirby, the Strategic Communications Coordinator for the National Security Council. Admiral, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. What is the administration first and foremost doing to find Americans who are missing or may in fact be held hostage tonight in Gaza?
Closely coordinating with Israeli counterparts to try to get as much information as we can from them about their knowledge of the hostage situation. We recognize that it's not just Americans that are being held hostage, but obviously many Israelis as well, and from people from other countries are most likely in that mix. So it's a complex picture. It's also a war zone. Hamas has done this before. This is part of their playbook to take hostages and use them as negotiating chips. They'll probably move them around. So it's going to be difficult to get much dexterity here in these early hours about where they are, who exactly is holding them, and in what conditions.
What's the status of conversations between the United States, Admiral, with Qatar? We do know that Qatar is potentially going to be working out a dialogue with Hamas to try to release these hostages. But at the same time, are you exerting pressure on Qatar, given the fact that they are housing Hamas leaders?
Well, we know that Hamas has access here to Hamas. That Qatar has access to Hamas that we certainly don't have, and the Israelis don't have. And so to the degree that Qatar can play a useful role here, we're going to encourage that, obviously. They've got a way to have dialogue and conversations. So we'll keep in close touch with our Qatari counterparts to glean whatever information they can find and can provide to us. We want to obviously get these people released. Hamas should release them now, immediately. Short of that, we're going to have to work closely together to try to figure out where they are and how we can affect their delivery from being hostages.
Curious as well, Admiral, what is the administration doing to reach out to Americans who might be stuck in Israel who are trying to get out of the country tonight?
Well, I don't. First of all, there's a lot of Americans there in Israel, as you might imagine, many dual nationals. The State Department is open for business and providing consular access to any Americans that have questions about either staying in Israel or leaving Israel. They can go to the embassy. They can get online. They can get information in context that they would leave. We're updating that information every day. I would remind those Americans who do want to leave, the airport at Ben Gurion is still operating. Commercial flights are still coming in and out. There are still open ground routes out of Israel. But we also have to know that many Americans that live there, they don't want to leave. Israel is their home as well. They have family, they have friends there. there. They have businesses, colleagues that they don't want to leave. So we're not tracking right now an immense demand signal by thousands and thousands of Americans who want to leave.
The U.S. continues to say that does not have direct evidence that implicates Iran very directly with this. But we had Minister Ron Dermer on Bloomberg earlier this week, and he said it is now their working condition that there is evidence out there that directly implicates Iran. Is Israel sharing that intelligence with the White House?
I won't talk about the intelligence picture or the status of specific intel sharing between us and Israel. We have a very robust intelligence sharing arrangement with Israel, which continues and obviously will be deepened here in the coming days and weeks. All I can tell you is that we have not seen specific evidence that links Iran to these particular attacks. Obviously, they're complicit because they have supported Hamas for so many years, but just no specific intelligence with respect to these attacks that I can speak to.
So does that mean that Israel and the United States are working under different conditions?
Again, I'm not going to speak about the intel sharing arrangement or the specifics here. Our Israeli counterparts are looking at the intel picture as well, as you would expect they would. They can speak to what they've discovered or not discovered. All I can tell you is we have seen no specific evidence.
We heard from President Biden today at the White House. Admiral, we're going to give our viewers a chance to hear what he said and would love to ask you a question about that. Here he is.
We're surging additional military assistance, including ammunition and interceptors, to replenish Iron Dome. We're going to make sure that Israel does not run out of these critical assets. When Congress returns, we're going to ask them to take urgent action to fund the national security requirements of our critical partners.
Admiral, when we consider surging military assistance, we're of course thinking as well about the Gerald Ford carrier strike group that is steaming its way toward Israel right now. And there were some comments today from President Erdogan of Turkey. He said in a news conference, "What is the U.S. aircraft carrier doing in Israel?" He went on to say it is going to shoot around Gaza and cause a very serious massacre. You can respond to that how you like, but I wonder if we could be specific here about the role that the Gerald Ford strike group is going to play in this fight for Israel.
The principal role of moving that carrier strike group into the eastern Mediterranean is one of deterrence, to send a strong signal to any other actor, any other group, any other nation state that's hostile to Israel, that if you're thinking about getting involved in here, if you're thinking about escalating this war, this conflict, don't do it, as the president said. We have significant national security interests in the region. We have a robust military presence that is now more robust than it was yesterday. The president, as commander-in-chief, is going to do what he has to do to look after those national security interests. I'm not going to speculate about future military operations one way or another. There's absolutely no intention, no plan to put American boots on the ground in this conflict in Israel. But we do have serious national security interests that we have to make sure that we have the options to protect if we need to.
But what is your response to Erdogan? This is a NATO ally to the United States that's saying that the U.S. sending that warship more east in the Mediterranean is going to cause, quote, massacres in Gaza.
That carrier strike group that is in the eastern Med right now is there to deter any escalation of the conflict beyond where it is right now. That's my response to President Erdogan.
All right. John Kirby, thank you so much. We know you're working around the clock. We really appreciate you joining us again on Bloomberg TV today. Admiral John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the National Security Council. Thank you. Now, Joe, that was really something else, that conversation, because we look at what Recep Erdogan is saying, the Turkish president, criticizing the U.S. for sending this warship. This is a NATO ally.
Yes, this is a concern when you hear some already expressing worry about Israel overreaching in this case to the extent where not even all Democratic lawmakers agree on this. This is a fine line that we're obviously walking here.
Yeah, obviously. And joining us now, we have an Israeli official, Eliav Benjamin, Israel's deputy head of mission to the United States. Sir, thank you so much for your time. I'm not sure if you just heard us finish with that conversation with Admiral Kirby. I'd love to start with you about the hostages. There's about 20 Americans missing. We know there's quite a number of Israelis missing, and our deepest sympathies go to you and your country. This is what Jake Sullivan had to say earlier today. He said that in terms of what's happening in Gaza and evacuations, that the U.S. would be consulting with Israel and Egypt to facilitate civilian evacuations from Gaza. Is Israel going to help facilitate these types of evacuations out of Gaza, even though we do know that Israel is right now striking the Gaza Strip?
So thank you, Anne-Marie and Joe for hosting and for this. We are at war now. I'm reminding us all we're at war, something which Hamas started, and we are now taking to the next level to make sure that Hamas get a very clear message, and not only them, but also all the other foes in the region, including Iran, including Hezbollah and others. And at the same time, while the Hamas organization, as a terrorist organization, and others are holding people in captivity as they've kidnapped them, including, as we understand, also American citizens. We don't know the exact number. We don't know the exact number in general of those in captivity there. So we are caring about them. We will start seeing what we can do to get them, to have them released in a very safe way. But we do need to remember that we are at war now. We'll continue striking very, very hard on Hamas.
Well, that's absolutely right. And I know Israel is gathering troops along the Gaza border ahead of a potential ground invasion. Is this still, at this point, a hostage rescue mission?
No, absolutely not. It wasn't a hostage rescue mission to begin with. That is maybe part of it. But the main object of this whole battle now, as far as we're concerned, which was forced on us, is to basically crush Hamas as strongly and severely as possible for them to go back into their holes and to never come up again.
Does that mean you will not then wait to save or rescue hostages who are in Gaza? You will roll into Gaza when you're ready?
We will roll into Gaza when we feel the time is right to go and do what we have to do to smash and crush Hamas. And at the same time, we are trying to see how we can help the situation of those in captivity. It has nothing to do with each other.
Well, it only has to do with each other, sir, if these individuals, these hostages are hiding, but a missile strikes potentially this apartment building or a tunnel that they're hiding in. We do know that Qatar is leading a dialogue with Hamas to try to have the release of these hostages. Is it your understanding that that is happening? Is it your understanding that they are making any sort of progress?
I understand that there are all kinds of back channels that are already in operation to see what the situation is with the hostages and with those who've been kidnapped. And there are probably discussions going on in this regard. But again, I want to re-emphasize to everybody, this is a war, and we have something to deal with, which is great and dire to our situation now, to make sure that we have no further people taken into captivity. And for this end, and to this end, we need to strike them as strongly as possible. So yes, those in captivity is something that we are dealing with. We know how to operate also in a precise manner. We really hope that we will not have to, that we will not strike anybody who is uninvolved in this issue. But at the end of the day, this is a war, and we need to strike Hamas.
Well, so what then broadly is Israel's goal here in the long term, and does it include rescuing hostages?
Absolutely. The idea of rescuing the hostages is a big part of it as far as we're concerned. But again, this is part of the picture. At the end of the day, it's not a rescue. It's not just a rescue operation. It's an operation to come and basically handicap Hamas with their ability that they have today of military operations, of terrorist operations, of sovereignty over Gaza, for them to go back into their holes and not to continue attacking Israel with terrorism across the country.
We hear you from Washington, Eliav Benjamin. We thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts tonight. Israel's deputy head of mission to the United States with us on Bloomberg. We now bring in our reporter roundtable. Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson and Dan Flatley are with us here at the table in Washington. It's great to have you both with us. You just heard our conversation. Dan, how do you do both? How do you wage a war and conduct a hostage rescue mission at the same time?
It's very difficult, obviously. And I don't think that the Israelis have any illusions about the difficulty of what's ahead of them. As you heard the deputy ambassador there speaking about, they will try to do both at the same time, and that will require some precision. And he didn't really dismiss the idea of collateral damage, potentially. And I think that that is something that, in his very unequivocal remarks, we take those at face value, and obviously they realize what they're up against here. Sobering. So, very sobering, yes.
We do know, due to the president's comments today, to Jake Sullivan's comments today, that Americans are likely, well, the president said no, they are held hostage. I wonder what kind of pressure Israel will be under from not just America, but other nationals that were taken hostage by Hamas to make sure that, to Dan's point, that precision better be correct.
I'm sure they will be under pressure, but if there's one thing we know about Israel, watching them over the years, they are very immune, I should say, to pressure from the international community. They do what they believe is right for the security of their nation, and they will do it. And I think Eliav Benjamin there was, as Dan said, extremely unequivocal. They're going to crush Hamas. If they can rescue some hostages at the same time, great. But the primary objective, in his words, were to crush Hamas.
Getting back to our conversation with John Kirby, we just learned a lot in the last 15 minutes here. The Gerald Ford strike group is going to be a key component, I assume, in the operational side of this. I realize that the carrier strike group may not be sending fighter jets into Israel or troops into Israel anytime soon, but this is an incredibly capable, high-tech operation here that could do a lot to help Israel in coordination and intelligence. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Joe. I mean, if you look at what Admiral Kirby said, he said the U.S. is going to be deepening its intelligence relationship with Israel. Yeah. So what does that mean? How did this happen? My colleague Pete Martin had a great story out today about some of the intelligence failures that led up to this. And one of the things that he identified in his story was the fact that Hamas essentially went dark. And that means no electronic communications. That phase of whatever this was is over now. And I think we can assume that there are going to be some communications happening now, especially as Hamas tries to assume a defensive posture based on whatever the Israelis are going to do. And the strike group will play a role in that, I'm sure.
We're also getting two different tones from Israel and the United States when it comes to Iran. Ron Dermer told our colleagues that it is their working condition at this moment that there is evidence that more directly links Iran to this specific attack, while the United States continues to say they do not see that evidence, and that it's not their, John Kirby just said it's not their working condition.
Right.
How difficult is that going to be? Because if Iran is more complicit in this and directly linked, this has real risks of broadening out in the region. Absolutely.
And you heard Admiral Kirby say the strike group is there to serve as a deterrent. And I think they're trying to tread a very thin line here between directly connecting Iran to these attacks and just saying that they've provided support over the years, which we know. So he said there's no evidence that we've seen so far, but he didn't say that there's not evidence. So it's potential, that this could come to light in the coming days. And that's part of the sensitivity of this issue is once you bring that evidence forward, you're sort of compelled to act. And I think that that's what they want to avoid at this point before all the cards are on the table, basically.
Wow. I think there's also politics involved very quickly. I mean, it's not in the U.S. interest to poke the bear of Iran right now for the U.S., and Israel's been, frankly, itching to get into it with Iran for years. So, sure, to Ron Dermer's ears, it was Iran. To Biden's ears, let's be a little more careful.
This, of course, is all happening against the backdrop of a speaker's fight here in Washington that also plays into Israel by way of funding, which remains a question. And this is a story that really has not progressed. We had a visit today here at Bloomberg in Washington by Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, a Republican, of course. He spoke to the chaos in the House Republican caucus and how it's echoing throughout the party. Here's what he said.
It's a train wreck. I mean, it's embarrassing. And I think it's terrible for the Republican Party. I think it's terrible for the Congress and for the country. The fact that you can have a handful of extremist kind of quacks off the rails that can put us in this kind of jeopardy. And it was a terrible mistake.
He wasn't mincing words, of course. He's also said to be on the short list if there were, and he did speak to this, the opportunity for maybe either a Republican candidacy or a no-labels candidacy on his behalf. But he's speaking to the ripple effects outside of the Beltway. How much time do Republicans have in Washington to figure this out?
Well, not much. The government's going to shut down again on November 17th if they can't get the spending fight done. But they can't get the spending fight done, the budget passed, until they have a speaker, nor can they speed aid to Israel or Ukraine until they have a leader. They're talking about giving the temporary acting speaker, Patrick McHenry, some new powers so they can do that. Democrats are thinking about going along with that. But, you know, tomorrow we are supposed to start voting. House Republicans, I should say, are supposed to start voting on a speaker. One of those guys, Steve Scalise or Jim Jordan, has to have 218 votes or 217 votes. I don't see that happening in the next 48 hours, but, you know, maybe this will spur some action.
Dan, you're up on the Hill all the time. You also were in the Army, so you actually understand kind of how aid gets done and then what it's used for. How likely is the pressure building on this Republican Party to quickly get a speaker so they can, in fact, supply aid to Israel and also Ukraine? Because the president said for the national security concerns of our, quote, partners.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do have to clarify, I was in the Marine Corps, and as any good Marine will tell you,
My
don't
deepest
get those
apologies.
confused, but it's okay. I thought that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that a lot of this political infighting would sort of go away based on what's the very serious matters that are unfolding on the world stage. And yet here we are. Of course, the speaker fight began before the events of this weekend unfolded, but still, I don't necessarily think that because there's a crisis on the world stage, it's going to impel our congressional representatives to move more quickly to resolve their internal squabbles. That is something that, as we've seen, is going to be a perennial issue in D.C., no matter what's happening abroad.
And there's no such thing as a former Marine, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. I was Marine.
Marine Dan Flatley, we all stand corrected, and Wendy Benjaminson. Thank you both so much for joining us on this very important day and a very important conversation. Coming up, we turn back to the war in Israel and what it could mean for the future of monetary policy here in the United States. The details with Kaylee Lyons next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
When I think about the impact of that on the global economy, on the U.S. economy, the first thing that comes to my mind is really the issue of uncertainty. This is just another new, unexpected thing that is going to cause everyone to have to rethink, like, where are our markets going to be, where are our partners going to be.
Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic there today speaking about the potential economic impact of war in Israel as bond markets evaluate what it might mean for the path forward for monetary policy. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is here with more. Hey, Kaylee.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, we certainly saw some pretty dramatic moves in the bond market today, really all across the yield curve. The 2-year down 13 basis points on the day, the 10-year down by 15 basis points. And in part, this may just be a flight to the safety of the Treasury market, given the uncertainty in the Middle East, knowing the Treasury market was closed for a holiday yesterday. But part of this is the unwinding of expectations for further Fed hikes, because leading up to today, we had seen a massive run up in yields. The 10-year was up more than 50 basis points since the start of September. And in doing so, higher rates have effectively tightened financial conditions, which is exactly what the Federal Reserve is trying to achieve through its interest rate hikes. So in theory, the bond market may have done some of the Fed's work for it already. And this is an idea that a number of Fed speakers have talked about earlier this week, including the Dallas Fed President, Lori Logan, yesterday.
Higher term premiums result in higher term interest rates for the same setting of the Fed funds rate, all else equal. Thus, if term premiums rise, they could do some of the work of cooling the economy for us, leaving less need for additional monetary policy tightening to achieve the FOMC's objectives.
And that is what the market is now betting on. Markets are now pricing 60% odds that the Fed is done hiking rates. Just last week, it was 60% odds that the Fed would hike again. But of course, the Fed is data dependent, and we get more inflation data tomorrow and Thursday here in the U.S. September CPI and PPI could prove pretty critical.
So it's going to take a few data points for us to know whether the bond market is actually doing the Fed's job for it, as we keep hearing.
Exactly right.
Thanks, Kayleigh. As always, Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lines here on Balance of Power. Coming up, how does the U.S. get involved as Israeli forces prepare for a possible incursion in Gaza? Leon Panetta joins the program next. This is Bloomberg.
Any organization, anyone thinking of taking advantage of this situation, I have one word: don't. Don't.
President Biden warning other groups to not get involved in the Israeli conflict. Let's bring in Leon Panetta now, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, CIA Director, and White House Chief of Staff, as well as current chair of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy, back with us on Bloomberg. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you. We've been looking forward to the conversation here. The Israeli military, as Bloomberg is reporting, is building a base for thousands of soldiers in preparation for what appears to be a ground invasion of Gaza. Can you tell our viewers here what to expect, having worked on both the military and intelligence side here, in the days ahead, once this action actually begins? If the goal is to destroy Hamas, what will become of Gaza?
Well, I don't think there's much question that Israel is going to do a ground invasion of Gaza. I've talked to friends in Israel. There's a very strong feeling that Israel has to go after Hamas for these unspeakable horrors that they've been engaged in. And they've got over 300,000 reservists that have been mobilized. It's a big force. I think, as always, going into Gaza is not going to be easy. They've tried it before. The problem is that it's basically house-to-house fighting once you get into Gaza, and so it could be a heavy price. But on the other hand, I think it is very clear that Israel has made the decision that they have got to crush Hamas in Gaza.
If they are going to be crushing Hamas in Gaza, what about the hostages? How do they do both at the same time? The sense Joe and I got from the deputy chief of mission at the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C., was that the hostages may just become collateral damage.
Yeah, it's a tough choice. Obviously, on the one hand, they're going to initiate an offensive in Gaza. On the other hand, they do have to worry about these hostages. I'm assuming that at the same time they're conducting this offensive, that they're making every effort to try to gather intelligence as to where these hostages may be located, and then use that intelligence to try to see if they can do some kind of special operation to rescue them. So I don't think they've given up on it, but clearly they cannot simply be blackmailed by Hamas. They have got to do what they believe is necessary in order to secure Israel.
Well, you have unique experience here, obviously, in the period of time in which you served in the Pentagon and in the CIA. You oversaw the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. And there have been a lot of references here to the so-called war on terror. How difficult will it be for Israel to conduct an asymmetrical war with a non-state entity? They won't see uniforms, of course, Mr. Secretary, when they go into Gaza.
In many ways, we had the same issue in going after al-Qaeda. You know, we made the same decision that Israel's making after 9/11, which was that we had to do everything necessary to make sure that al-Qaeda was crushed and did not have the opportunity to conduct another 9/11 campaign. In order to conduct that campaign, we had to do a tremendous amount of surveillance in order to make sure that we were looking at the right targets. We went after those targets and ultimately, of course, got bin Laden. I think Israel, in many ways, has made the decision that because of the atrocities committed by Hamas, they have to go in and defeat Hamas. And the only place Hamas is held up right now is in Gaza. Even though it's rough territory, I think Israel is probably now going through the process of thinking, how do we go into Gaza? How many columns do we send into Gaza? How much is done by artillery? How much is done by missiles of one kind or another? And do we use special forces to go in and try to attack specific targets? They may do a combination of all of those strategies in order to be able to ultimately win this part of their war.
I want to ask you about a state actor, and that's Iran. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan discussed the connection to Iran earlier today at the White House press briefing.
We've said since the beginning that Iran is complicit in this attack in a broad sense because they have provided the lion's share of the funding for the military wing of Hamas. They have provided training, they have provided capabilities, they have provided support. As to the question of whether Iran knew about this attack in advance or helped plan or direct this attack, we do not, as of the moment I'm standing here at the podium, have confirmation of that.
It seems Washington and Israel are looking at this evidence, and it is the working condition of Israel, per Minister Derma, that there is some direct evidence that links Iran. They're not ready to come forward with it, but this White House doesn't seem to see it. What do you think?
Well, I think Jake Sullivan is right that there's a long history here of Iran supporting Hamas, supporting Hezbollah, actually providing missiles to Hamas, providing support for terrorism in the region. So there's a long history here. And the Wall Street Journal article yesterday pretty much confirmed what they thought was a direct involvement by Iran in training and planning the Hamas mission in Israel. The United States states that we don't have clear information that was the case. And I think that, I'm sure, intelligence now is going through the process of seeing whether or not they can get the kind of firm information they need in order to make that judgment.
I'll ask you what we asked John Kirby earlier this hour, Mr. Secretary. The fact that the Gerald Ford strike group, the carrier group, is being moved toward Israel tells you what? Is that simply projecting power to be a deterrent, as the administration says, or will play a more precise role in what Israel is trying to accomplish?
Well, there's no question there's a lot of firepower in that group, and I'm glad to see them moving it into position. But as far as I can see right now, the name of the game is to provide the Israelis with whatever weapons and support they need in order to defend their country. And that means that, the United States is not going to get directly involved in going after specific targets. Now, is there a chance this war could expand? Certainly is. I mean, if Hezbollah suddenly decides to move in from Lebanon, if Iran makes some moves as well, then without question, this war could expand very rapidly, in which event, the United States would have to make a decision as to how much direct assistance it's going to provide. But at this point, the hope is that Israel can accomplish this on their own.
Secretary Panetta, thank you so much for your time this evening. Fantastic insight, of course, as the former defense secretary and head of the CIA. Coming up, there's a new urgency to replace ousted former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. We join by our political panel next with all the details. This is Balance of Power, live from Washington.
We had a really good, healthy discussion. Obviously, this has been going on for days. Members want to come together. We've got to get back on track. That means we've got to select a speaker, and you saw a strong resolve to make sure that we can come together quickly, get our speaker elected on Tuesday, Wednesday, the form obviously tomorrow night, Wednesday election.
Republican Congressman Stephen Scalise there. Obviously, he's hoping to be the next Speaker of the House. Well, let's bring in our political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO, and Matt Bennett, Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way and the former Deputy Assistant to President Bill Clinton. Thank you both for joining us. So the Republican members are meeting now. They're having this discussion. Steve Scalise, Jim Jordan are going to speak at it. Are we any closer today to potentially having a vote on the floor tomorrow about who could be the next Speaker of the House?
But would you like me to make you feel good, or would you like me to tell you the truth?
We want the truth.
Okay, no, we're not really any closer. They're right now, as we're doing the TV show, the Republican caucus that they're meeting again. The future Speaker will probably come through Republican Main Street Partnership because we have 90 votes that they need. So it's going to be a struggle. Neither one of them have it right now. So, and I don't see it moving yet, and I really don't see it moving by tomorrow, though we do need a speaker as soon as possible.
This is important to us because, of course, Sarah is the only one who predicted that they would avert a government shutdown. And so I have to ask you.
Have you not been on since? Oh, here's your moment to shine.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to ask you then, what do you make of the talk of Kevin McCarthy taking his time, coming in at the last minute as a possible solution here? As soon as he said that he was not going to run, and that today, he said he didn't want his name to be entered in the nomination. Right. Didn't you know at that moment that he actually did want that very thing to happen?
It's funny you say that. The group that wants to nominate him comes out of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Yeah. I do think if he would agree to do it, and I don't know if he will or not, I haven't spoken to him in a couple of days, but if he would agree to do it, he would have 200 votes. I mean, 96% of the caucus is with him. So you have to do a rules change first and then bring him up. So it's going to be interesting to watch. And this is history making. It really is. This has never happened in the country before. So this ends in a
rule change, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, potentially.
It should end there.
Yeah. Well, we heard from former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy yesterday. Take a listen.
You have 96% of the conference in one place, and you're allowing 4% with the Democrats playing politics, but now of putting a doubt inside this body. That is wrong.
Speaker McCarthy, former Speaker, saying Democrats are playing politics. Joe and I also spoke to Congressman Jim Clyburn yesterday. He said, I like Kevin McCarthy. I like Steve Scalise. I don't like Jim Jordan. So the Democrats have a chance here to decide how the next year will look. Will any of them offer support? I'm not saying a vote, but a president or just leave the chamber?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. I don't think they know.
Well, should they?
Perhaps. It depends on what is happening with the Republicans. But look, let's be clear about one thing. The fault for this is with the Republicans, not the Democrats. He was the Speaker of the House because he is a Republican and they have the majority. This is on them and not on the Democrats. Fixing this problem, because their conference is so divided, might come down to the Democrats, which might give Democrats the opportunity to do a little arbitrage and get somebody better than they might otherwise. I don't know if that'll happen, but I hope it does. And if it does happen, I hope they're smart about it.
Okay, well, I have to disagree with you.
How so?
Because if Kevin had not worked with the Democrats to keep the government open on Saturday, he would not have been recalled. So the Democrats have to own a small piece of this, or the government would have been shut down. And do you think President Biden would have done well with a government shutdown? I don't think so. So the Republicans did the right thing. The Republican Main Street Partnership voted with the Democrats to keep it open. They should have walked out on Tuesday. 3 of them, all they need to do is walk out.
But, Sarah, in all honesty, do you think the Republicans would have done the same for Speaker Pelosi.
I do. And actually, we were talking about that before we came in. There are some votes, like the transportation bill, that you can point to that the only reason they passed is because some of the Republicans voted with the Democrats. So there are some examples that, yes, the Republicans have done it in the past. And I think they would have walked out. I think there's a small group of them that would have said, listen, I can't vote president, but I'm willing to walk out to save democracy here. I mean, there's nothing going on in the House of Representatives. Yeah. You can't bring anything to the floor, and now Israel is at war. So, yeah, I really do think there's a few members of Main Street that would have done that.
Well, it certainly becomes a more urgent matter and certainly more about the institution when it comes to funding the government before November 17th. Would Democrats maybe find some wiggle room in supporting this idea of Patrick McHenry as a caretaker speaker for, say, 30 days or whatever it takes to get a budget done, get through that shutdown, and then Republicans can knock their heads together finding a full-time speaker?
Look, I think that's possible. There's a lot of possible paths to get there.
We're hypothetical heaven here today.
We are indeed.
Yeah.
And look, you know, nothing concentrates the mind like war, like Americans being killed and kidnapped. And I hope that this brings some sanity back. I mean, we are making history in Washington for all the wrong reasons. This is absolutely insane. This is supposed to be, we are the leaders of the free world, and we are not acting like it. So I do think that there may be opportunities to find a way forward, to make sure the government stays open, to make sure Israel is supported, and ultimately to do the things we have to do, like support our allies in Ukraine. I think that's possible, and maybe it's McHenry or some other avenue.
Well, they're all behind closed doors right now, Anne-Marie, trying to get some progress made on this. Coming up, the former governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, says he's not closing the door to running for president in 2024. He joined us today in the Bloomberg Bureau in Washington. We'll be back with more of our political panel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
The country is in that bad a shape next spring, and those are the two nominees, and it looks like there's a path. I would have no interest in being a spoiler. I don't want to run a race to nibble around the edges. If I thought there was a path to success to win the race, then I just said I wouldn't shut the door. However I can serve, I'm still trying to figure that out, but I'm not walking away, and I'm not willing to give up.
He's not walking away. Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan leaving the door open to a possible presidential run. In conversation earlier today with Bloomberg here in Washington. For more, we bring back our political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO, and Matt Bennett, Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way and former Deputy Assistant to President Bill Clinton. Matt, I'll start with you here because Third Way came up in that conversation with Larry Hogan, who's been floated repeatedly as a potential no-labels candidate. And I don't know if he was referring to that there or if he might run as a Republican if he sees some sort of lane. But I know Third Way has had some concerns about no labels being a major party spoiler for Joe Biden. Would he be the one to do it?
He might. And we are very concerned about somebody like Larry Hogan. Look, he was a very good governor. He governed Blue State as a Republican and a moderate. And my view of Larry Hogan is that he should help people like Sarah fix the Republican Party so that they function again. What he should not do is run in this kind of crazy fantasy world where a third-party candidate can somehow do what no one in history has ever done, including Teddy Roosevelt, who was carved into Mount Rushmore, tried to run as a third-party candidate and got annihilated. And that there is no path forward for a third-party candidate except that they can be spoilers. And I've worked on a couple of campaigns that have been spoiled by third-party candidates. I would beg Governor Hogan not to do it.
Well, Hillary Clinton would have won Michigan if it wasn't for the independent party that ran there.
And Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And those third-party candidates, Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, were basically nobodies. Nobody had ever heard of them. They had no money behind them. If the No Labels Party goes forward with this, and I very much hope they don't, they're going to have a lot of money, and they'll have somebody prominent like Hogan, and that would be a real problem.
Are Republicans funding No Labels? We asked questions about that because they haven't disclosed their donors, and I wonder if that's a strategy for Republicans to try to tip the cart in favor of a Republican nominee.
There's certainly a couple of them that I know of
that
are definitely funding No Labels. 100%, and giving them millions of dollars.
Which speaks to their motivation?
It could very well do that, because it does elect Donald Trump.
We also had RFK Jr. announce that he's going to be running independent. Yeah. But actually what people think is that he won't take votes from Biden. He's going to steal into Trump votes.
I agree with that. He will cut into Trump. You know, the anti-vax people, the conspiracy theorists, I think he will hurt Trump. But I don't know how much he'll hurt Trump, because he does have a last name of a Democrat. You know, Kennedys are Democrats. So it'll be interesting. I was kind of surprised to see him do that.
How about that? You add the factor of Cornel West, and it wouldn't take a lot. When you look at a state like Pennsylvania, for instance, look at a state like Georgia, where a Cornel West could actually impact the outcome. We're talking about 1 or 2 percentage points here in some of these states.
That's exactly right. Dr. West, who is a prominent African-American academic, him being on the ballot could have an impact, because this is a game of inches. Georgia and Arizona were decided by 0.2 and 0.3% of the vote last time. We're not talking about a lot of votes that have to move. Democrats are already struggling to keep black men, which was a voting bloc that we had for many decades, and they're beginning to erode, and I think somebody like West could do damage.
You're trying to get him out of the race as well?
No. We're hoping that Professor West decides to step aside on his own, but he has a lot of barriers to get over. He's got to get on the ballot in all these states. No Labels is already at that. They have the money. They're on the ballot in 11 states already.
We heard from Governor DeSantis today on MSNBC. Take a listen to what he had to say about President Trump being a deal breaker for those who want to vote Republican.
There are millions of voters out there who don't like what Biden's doing, think the country's in the wrong direction, going in the wrong direction. They want to vote for a Republican, but once it's Donald Trump, that's just a deal breaker for them. They just won't do it.
All right, we can talk about that in the sense that there are polling that indicates Americans are actually over Trump and Biden. Yeah. But let's talk about DeSantis for a second. We have Will Hurd dropping out, throwing his support behind Nikki Haley. Is he even more considered the second in the race to Trump?
I would argue that Nikki Haley is now. And I think that's why he went after Trump. You know, this is the first time he's really criticized President Trump. But I would say Nikki Haley is sitting there in the catbird seat if Trump loses, or if his criminal, catches up with him and he gets a jail sentence. But he is right. In our polling at Republican Main Street Partnership, there are thousands of people that like the president's policies, President Trump's policies, but don't like the man.
Right. Says a lot about his campaign, the fact that he's on MSNBC at this point.
It certainly does. Yeah. And Morning Joe, Sarah Chamberlain and Matt Bennett, thank you both for your time. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the Terminal and online for more stories.
We thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. I'll meet you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.